Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, first to the organizers and to everybody here for convening this summer school, for coming to the summer school and offering such a provocative occasion for us to think from the birthplace of Aristotle, no less. I very much appreciate just how much work such organizing means, and this whole week has been a luxurious place to think in. So I want to present something here that might either seem completely banal to you all and nothing new under the Platonic blinding sun, or depending on one's perspective, ranging from rather polemical to totally unacceptable. So we'll see. It's hard for me to tell, but mostly I'm going to play the idiot's part here in this room full of philosophers. Because although yesterday Thomas was commenting on how this summer school gathers a diverse crowd, indeed, including many non-philosophers and philosophers who do much more than philosophy, I, as a non-philosopher, feel like I've rarely been in so disciplinarily homogenous a space, actually, ironically, in a very long time. And yet it seems like many of us are involved in converge perhaps on the ambitious and perhaps undisciplined feral task of killing philosophy. Some à la Ruelle, some because they turn to a before philosophy and into chaosmogony. So there may be some resonances, there will be hopefully some resonances between what I'm about to advance here and that task, in that we're, of course, after immanence, movement, matter, much than that even, and of course, and to it, if really we are to even hold on to such a concept of nature, which is to me rather questionable. But yes, I'm about to offer what might nonetheless seem rather basic, idiotic even, for some of you, or perhaps heresy to others. We'll see. So my talk is titled Becoming Plato, Aporetic Callipolis Will Not Sustain Time. I don't know how to pronounce Callipolis, actually. I'll pronounce it my French way. Pardon my French. It's just not sure where to put the emphasis on the right syllable. But Callipolis is part of a second book project that that has been taking shape as I'm now finishing the first book. And the second book project briefly engages, it's a three-part thing. So it engages Nietzsche's notion of eternal return as a way to fend off both apocalyptic end times rhetorics that are so prevalent in a certain kind of environmentalism, as well as at the same time defying the so long-termism of so-called effective altruists. So that's one part of the project, is Nietzsche's eternal return. And another part, I turned to Samuel Beckett's Unnameable, to think the endlessness and unbearable inescapability of life, non-life as processes, rather than bemoaning human extinction, as some in some environmentalist circles do. And so what I'm about to share here with you is a very, very first sketch for a dramaturgical reading of Plato, which will hopefully turn into another part of this three-part project. And it's the book is tentatively titled The Dance of Time, Plato, Nietzsche, and the Unnameable Weight of Becoming. Granted, if we have time, I'll also try to provide some connection with my first book project, which I'm finishing this fall, and which focused also on questions of ecology and temporality. But again, I'm looking at this as a political theorist, transdisciplinary political theorist, and so perhaps a little bit differently than strictly philosophy or something like that. Not that there's any strict philosophers in this room, but so that's for a bit of context. Now on to Becoming Plato and a dramaturgical reading of the Republic as tragic aporia rather than as utopia. So back to the beginning, I started expressing my gratitude about our opportunity to think together in a materialist and immanentist, though not new materialist vein, in a location such as Aristotle's birthplace. And in this context, it might seem strange to propose a discussion of Plato's Republic when we have so often been told that Plato's most famous student, who especially haunts us here, stood against his teacher to affirm materiality and immanence, to enable us to think motion, bringing philosophy back to earth, Whereas at least the major, I will argue, reading of Platonism would imagine Plato as standing in defense of capital T truth, transcendence, idealism, the rightly blamed demons that several of us are busying ourselves trying to fend off by now, in part because these demons have enabled, I would argue, I think we might agree, a rather recent and relatively anomalous, deeply violent political and economic regime that some have called capitalism to wreak havoc upon Earth to the point that the whole place is becoming increasingly uninhabitable. In such a reading of Plato, we imagine Plato, so in that major reading, we imagine Plato telling us, and here obviously I'm building a straw man, a major reading of Plato that so I'm therefore forcing the trait a bit and caricaturing. But Plato is telling us, so the story goes, that dialectical reasoning, speculation, abstract thinking alone shall uncover truth, that dialectical reason alone is capable, and of course capable is arguably the first error in this hegemonic reading of Plato, of revealing the famous Platonic forms as eternal and unchangeable essences from underneath the also platonically dismissed illusory, deceptive, misleading veil of sensorial experience, empirical inquiry, or analogical thinking. Once upon a time, as this story of Platonism goes, Plato transcribed the oral teachings of his controversial mentor, Socrates, who would feature in most of the resulting written dialogues as an increasingly fictitious character. And indeed, as we know, some scholars of Plato, the preeminent ones, Vlastos, etc., insist on the distinction between a historic Socrates of the earlier dialogues and a Socrates as character in the middle dialogues. And the story goes, we readers could more or less safely suspect somehow that Plato, as transcriber of the oral teachings of historic Socrates in the early dialogues, acted as a form of, as a sort of mouth with some degree of resonance between the two, making the Platonic corpus a relatively coherent continuum. Indeed, I'm again forcing the trait, but indeed in this major story of Plato, rather than stressing contradiction, the mouthpiece of Socrates that births substantively non-fundamental tensions. So once upon a time, as this major reading of Plato would still somehow have it, the text that strangely came to be known under, or the texts in plural, that strangely came to be known under the title of The Republic, exposited some of the principal ideas of Platonism, including on the epistemological front, the concept of idea, the theory of forms, the dialectical method for accessing such ideas and eternal forms, and on the ethical front, the neat equation between the good and the true, and on the political and programmatic front, and this is what I'm most interested in here, the utopian city matching the hierarchized, orderly, unified epistemological system and founded upon a merger of power and knowledge, whereby those who have access to ideas hold the condition for just rule. We all know this, we all know all this, or so we think. Or maybe some of you have long been raising eyebrows at what I am portraying caricaturally here. I am seeing that of this major reading of Plato. But if so, please bear with me while you enjoy a short interlude about, very generally put, some of the stakes and effects of this major narrative. From this story of Plato, which I just somewhat grossly and ironically retold, a major thread in Western philosophical and political traditions unfolds to provide and to shape to this day the foundations of many shades of positivism with all sorts of eco-political implications, especially omnipresent in our contemporary disastrous ecological condition, where, as Bruno Latour, my best friend, referring to that guy as a tough bitch article, where I did attack him, but his earlier work I'm taking on here. Bruno Latour once pointed out especially in ecology and politics, that scientists have become the authorities capable to save us from ourselves insofar as we are told they are endowed with the exclusive ability to come in and out of the obscure cave of politics, up above to the light of nature and its unquestionable laws, reporting back to illuminate and inform political decisions in turn. Any struggle over ecological matters, which seems to have become coterminous with any struggle at large these days, because we can't avoid anymore the thinking of the oikos as we destroy it, becomes reduced to a fight over who is authorized to speak the capital T truth of nature, what will count as such a truth, and to the act of distinguishing these from what, on the other hand, belongs in the realm of falsehoods and their associated political ineptitudes. This may seem to be in question with what some have called the post-truth age, but my sense, and I suspect we'll agree on that, is that it's especially the case that this reductionism of all eco-political matters to will to truth and to power prevails all the more so in a so-called post-truth context, ironically. So it's not quite post-truth, but quite to the contrary. Conspiracy theorists are now trying to claim the part of critics. Critics are dismissed as conspiracy theorists. We find ourselves eternally caught up in the battle of accusations of sophistry and claims to incarnation of a pure knowledge apt to ground planetary solutions, quotation marks on that, for our global problems. One example, and this is what I mean by what's at stake about the major Plato being so present in the way we think of science and politics. One example of the latter hubris would be that which the eco-Leninist Andras Malm, he's a Leninist, nobody's perfect, but he's also a fantastic ecological geographer. Andras Malm has chronicled in his latest book, Overshoot, the way in which the Paris agreements on climate have consecrated a shift of paradigm in favor of overshooting the 2 degrees Celsius threshold that had been advocated for by the Global South, and subsequently correcting this overshoot via geoengineering techno-fix. We're then caught, and very few ecological thinkers and activists somehow seem to realize this, I think, between the Paris Accords having techno-fixery and science-backed industrialisms on steroids triumph, and in part thanks to the heavy presence of Shell, ExxonMobil, et cetera, at the summits in Paris, and liberal environmentalists or simply people who do not read, and we can't blame them, the IPCC reports or the Paris Agreement texts, which is most people, likely probably they would be horrified if they actually realized what is in the Accords, but then they're bemoaning the sophist-in-chief Donald Trump regularly pulling out of the Accords. So we're caught between technoscience telling us the truth about climate, and then Trump and his sophistry without realizing what it is that we're summoned to be behind, I would argue. So that's just one example, but this is to convey some of what is at stake in my rereading Plato here. Now back to this major reading of Plato that I've ironically described so far, while perhaps forcing the trait and admittedly building a bit of a straw man. I want to argue that that major Plato and its tendrils into politics and science, in turn may be a form of sophistry. And in an attempt to perhaps begin to contest this ecologically and politically destructive landscape we're in, I would like to advance a sketch for a dramaturgical reading of the Republic as a polyphonic, contradictory dialogue that, rather than expositing a programmatic utopia, stages a tragic aporia. So then Plato's Republic as aporia with which to rethink our ecological predicament, rather than as utopia to apply and dictate a would-be objectively proper conduct, often inspired by science, capital S. I should specify that with this, I am by no means pretending to advance a new reading of the Republic, especially as I'm addressing philosophers. I'll assume that you all are likely more familiar than I am even with the discussions about the tensions in the text, at least the ones taking place within philosophy and among specialists of Plato, and even more largely among classicists and philology, etc. Nonetheless, it seems to me that the reading of Plato that ignores the tensions and indeed still is indeed still the hegemonic one, at least beyond the more astute and specialized readers of the text. It shapes Platonism's legacy within ordinary political much scientific, technological, and other discourse, with far-reaching epistemological and political effects, such as the ones I've exemplified just a minute ago. And it grounds what one could perhaps describe as eco-hubris, instead of inspiring a badly needed eco-humility. An eco-humility, I think the minor reading of Plato is ironically quite capable of inspiring potentially, so that the hegemonic status of the major reading of Plato makes for quite the missed opportunity, in addition to doing its own damage, as it founds certain destructive positivisms, as well as a certain image of time, which is my direction here, and what I want to emphasize eventually, that question of time. In other words, to many, perhaps to most, reading the Republic by stressing aporia rather than utopia would be an unacceptable form of what Deleuze provocatively characterized as consensual ass-fucking in his off-cited description of his approach to philosophical texts, whereby one would work the concepts in such a way that by the time the reading is done, their author, if he could be resuscitated to hear the music, would not be able but to help recognizing the concepts as his children, now in bastardized monstrous form. The issue, though, is that the more I have read and taught the Republic in an aporetic, polyphonic, dramaturgical, and even tragic vein, the more convinced I have made myself that Plato, if indeed resuscitated to witness what has become of Platonism in certain contemporary positivist and political guises, would be horrified and rather side with the minor reading. And this conviction even goes so far in my darkest hours to have me consider the possibility that Nietzsche might have been quite wrong in blaming Socrates for killing tragedy. Though perhaps this morning I will not push the paranoid reading quite to this extreme for love of Nietzsche. But either way, the point is not to make some final truth claim about Plato's actual intentions or what he truly meant. The point rather would be to put a wrench into how the Platonic political philosophical legacy, reducing what's in Plato's text to a caricature, has perhaps caused us to misunderstand the world at a moment when we so badly need to change it. Sorry, that's like a very cliched wink wink at the 11th thesis, but I couldn't help myself. I now just would like to mention a few examples about and in the Republic for this purpose of destabilizing the major story of Plato's masterpiece as Utopia in favor of a polyphonic play of aporia. Granted, of course, there's so much more textual evidence in the text, and we can for sure discuss this further later. Yeah, just a couple of examples. So then a minor reading of Plato, troubling the story of Plato I started with, considers how the Republic contains in negative, in the gaps of the various allegories that succeed each other throughout the text, a lot to teach us about time and simulacra, and Deleuze has offered such a reading beautifully in Logic of Sense, and about, most importantly for my purposes, the unstoppability of motion and decay becoming an immanence. The theatrics of an immanent world of becoming accessible only in mediated form through serial trial that seems to remain once the text unfolds. This formal aporia, that is to say, the staging of claims against stories, analogies, images in favor of pure dialectical reasons, ironically in the form of myriad stories, analogies, and images, is profoundly destabilizing of the whole political project, if there be such a thing as a whole project there. Furthermore, in the Republic, as Deleuze has underscored, if the question explicitly raised is that of the definition of justice, the political philosophical problem posed has to do much more with the contestation over power and the question of who and what gets to rule on the basis of what criteria, how the finding of such criteria, most importantly, would stabilize power over time. And in response to this problem, of course, we have the concept of idea, but that is unattainable. And yet, it's unattainable and it's lost in a sea of allegories, stories, analogies, dialogic incursions. So the ambiguous relationship and the gaps between the character of Socrates in the text, the historic figure of Socrates as Plato's teacher, later transcribed by him, though Socrates abhorred the written word, Plato as author, along with the polyphonic nature of the dialogue, featuring a Socrates whose narration of the dialogue is written in no less than the first person this time around in the Republic, thus doubling Socrates' participation both as dialogical character and as narrator. And on top of that, the many objections that Socrates' interlocutors propose and sometimes leaves not debunked, all that troubles the would-be purity of a major Plato. Again, Plato has sometimes been taken or mistaken as involved in positing himself as the mouthpiece of his teacher Socrates, even in the middle dialogues, such as the Republic, which we seem to know is farther from a transcript of Socrates' teaching than the earlier dialogues had been. And vice versa, the character of Socrates in the text would in turn be read as a mouthpiece for Plato's ideas, with the sliding between the two being but a process of mourning the great teacher, expressing a desire to avenge his death, literally, and that's my qualm precisely here, is to say that Plato is not a literal writer, but a literary one, consecrating Socrates through the philosopher king figure in acute danger whenever he dares return to the cave. In the major story of Plato, one could allegedly reduce Plato's philosophy to whatever arguments are developed in Socrates' long tirades, making these a literal defense of the Platonic epistemological and ontopolitical utopian claims assembled in a would-be systematic, supposedly coherent treatise. And yet, the text reads more as a theater play, replete with contradictory narrative incisions. Metafictional drama between the dialogue's protagonists is regularly cut through by, not anecdotally, storytelling and long speeches. The flattening of the Republic as some sort of programmatic treatise, in spite of its dialogic, polyphonic, theatrical, and multiply narrative forms, its mixed literary genres, also ignores that in the Gorgias, I'm going out the text for intertextuality here, but in the Gorgias, the distinction between the Elenctic Socratic philosophical method on the one hand and the democratic sophist orator's approach on the other is characterized for the latter by long speeches performed by a single orator over a short period of time to audiences as mass, whereas the former, philosophy, would consist in dialogues involving a few individuals only over a lengthy, extended period of time, and ultimately an aporetic conversation. The Republic, meanwhile, is a disorienting mix of the two. And it is precisely in these frictions between and within literary forms, dialogical, narrative, essay, allegorical, etc., that the text provokes us to think. It stages Socrates' now long speeches, his allegories, analogies, and stories of the crafts of myth of metals, the invisible ring, the lion and the sun analogies, the cave allegory, the ship analogy, the myth of Ur, intertwined and punctuated with dialogical interludes. And I want to argue that the interludes are not the stories and the allegories, but rather the dialogues. So it's a shift in emphasis in terms of the literary forms. But so that makes for a polyphonic, literary, multi-genre, dizzying assemblage. These tensions are at profound odds with a reading of the text as some utopian written program proposed as systematic template for what is true, right, or just, according to either Plato or Socrates or both. And even beyond this mixed form that intimately weaves together speeches and dialogue, tragic theatrics and dialectical speculation, even as it claims the latter is distinct from and superior to the former from the get-go, even while that's the principle of the resort to the written form, the Platonic act of transcription, betrays Plato's teacher's reticence to the written word in favor of orality, a pharmacological tension that famously caused Derrida to call Socrates the last sophist, as we might recall. And indeed, what I am stressing here, nothing is all that new under the Platonic literary sun that blinds us the minute we make eye contact with it in anything but story-mediated prose. Plato, we're told, and I'll grant you this anecdote is perhaps apocryphal, but once had fancied himself as a playwright and burned his plays when encountering Socrates to devote himself to Socrates' teachings. But if indeed the point was to propose a systematic, utopian, self-coherent, and smooth political, epistemological, and ontological program stemming out of his teacher's teachings, then what would have stopped him from simply, while he was betraying the orality and written word anyway, composing a clear and ambiguous treatise instead of shaping a polyphonic text so rich with literary forms? So surely the process of imagining Socrates as exposing a whole program for an ideal city and deducing from it a portrait of the citizen as a just man, as well as an ideal of justice, cannot be reduced to a literal manifesto outlining how to crown philosophers king. But swallowing the notion that Plato, as the writer that he was unaware of the traitor kind of performative gesture he was committing in many ways, not to mention the contradictory status of the plural and mixed literary forms, would, it seem to me, amount to considering Plato as rather silly, which we could. But it seems to me that this text is much more than literal and rather literary. Indeed, it would even seem that such a reading would have Plato become a simple advocate of authoritarian rule, of a closed society, in Karl Popper's phrase. And what I'm proposing instead is that the text also contains very prominently depictions of the cracks in the perfect city's walls, showing that such a totalizing authoritarian project is actually untenable, even in the event that the authority could lie into the hands of the absolute wisest, which recognition of untenability implies a rather radical political critique. Now, mind you, I'm not making Plato into an anarchist, or not quite, but I want to stress that Plato was primarily a writer and a dramaturg, and that as such, some dimensions of the text carry threads for a radical deconstruction of power and knowledge. On this last front, in fact, if the gesture is also one of provocation against an Athens that had sentenced Plato's mentor to death for lack of being capable of tolerating his anti-conformist views and his stirring trouble, corrupting the youth, etc., if claiming that the philosopher's place in the city is deeply precarious and even dangerous, while instead the philosopher would ironically, in the sense of, and in a sense tragically, make for the most just, legitimate stabilizing ruler, the rhetorical vengeance in defense of the murdered teacher also paradoxically rings as a betrayal of his teachings. He who tragically renounced fleeing into exile when presented the poison, and who accepted his own ostracization while chronically refusing here a certain kind of perhaps fetishization of aporia that you were reproaching some yesterday, Katerina, but I'll go with it and we can have a discussion about that later. I say especially here, I said especially in the early dialogues, and this element is of course important insofar as the major story about Plato would explain this, that major narrative would explain this evolution in the Platonic corpus as a growing into assertive claims away from aporia onto more of a program on the part of Plato with some nuances, right? So we have this utopia, and it doesn't work intimately, but we'll approximate it, and it's an aspiration. I want to contest that, actually, and argue for a more radical collapse of utopia. What if we read the movement of the texts as instead symptomatic of increased levels of and multiplied layers of irony and even parody? The Socrates of the Apology and of the Crito had indeed stressed aporia as fundamental to the process of philosophical engagement, in insisting that if there be a point of the philosophical exercise, this point would humbly have to do with knowing how little one knows, classically, and recognizing or even endlessly searching the limits of knowledge and humbly favoring a care for the soul over care for money or honor or power. From this humility and this refusal to the philosopher king, whose knowledge founds an albeit unwanted power, the irony can hardly be ignored. And again, I'm not bringing up anything particularly new for specialists of philosophy, I think here, but I'm trying to take on a certain kind of caricature of these, or an erasing of these tensions in the way that the major Plato functions in political discourse. This tension of the political level, at the political level, erupts quite flagrantly, in epistemological terms in the line analogy, just for one example, among many other possible passages of the text that we could look at. There, there Plato stages Socrates as famously saying, and this is at 509e, I quote, "Imagine taking a line which has been divided into two unequal sections and dividing each section, the one representing the category of the seen and the one representing the category of the understood, again in the same proportion," end quote. Already in just the first verses, I'll call them verses, of this analogy, we are invited to imagine, though the point will be to draw boundaries between imagination as sufficient to think thought or even less reason. But the invitation is to imagine the way in which the seen and the understood are divided into unequal sections, and then the subsections, same proportions, is notoriously left ambiguous as to which section is the longest, and we are not told either what their respective lengths are supposed to represent, though we are clearly told that these are representations, right? In the category of the scene, the first section is images. Sorry, I skipped a part. I don't know. So we're already two steps removed, basically, and dealing with a representation of representation in the very argument about going beyond representation. Socrates continues saying, I quote, "The clearness or obscurity of the sections of the line relative to one another you will find to be as follows. In the category of the scene, the first section is images, by which I mean in the first place shadows, and in the second place reflections in water or any dense, smooth, shiny surface, everything of that sort, if you see what I mean." I love the "if you see what I mean." Everything of that sort, if you see what I mean. Sure, we do not. And so beyond the ironic innuendos and even the potential laughter that this can elicit, the fact that clearness and obscurity become the indirect ways, the images, right, in which the sections come to signify or represent more or less proximity with pure knowledge, therefore making images closer to truth than shadows, for instance, themselves further than shiny surfaces from the forms, that's only deduced from the relation between this line analogy and the sun analogy. Obscurity and light represent as images drawn from the material world and material observation, the capacity to discriminate between degrees of falsehood and truth. So then it is only thanks to an imagined line as analogy in relation to another analogy that we can represent understanding, including in its most pure form, or allegedly pure. And we are famously told, "Indeed, we know experientially the sun will blind us the minute we attempt to look at it." I appreciate the basic nature of these observations and of the analogies meant to convey the idea of unmediated idea here and the notion of simulacra, as Deleuze has pointed out. But again, the matter isn't whether or not there is anything new under Plato's sun as far as ambiguities and aporia go, but rather to ask why these ambiguities, this aporia, as well as their consequences for what is so often considered as a whole project, among many others, are routinely ignored in political discourse, and even in some critical discourse about Plato, to only pay attention to the major line of argument here, rather than the literary troubles, and on this basis, either ground scientific and political projects or dismiss those. In other words, could it be that that anti-philosophical theatrics always have been present in this would-be foundational text? and that though we know it perfectly well to be the case, we operate as if it wasn't when Platonism is deployed for political purposes. If Socrates is indeed the last sophist per Derrida's musings, and Plato equally a trickster, then the joke is on us and the task rather dizzying to understand the political ramifications of this. Some are quite explicit, this time not in analogical forms, but in hypothetical fictional form, first mocked, but then seriously considered. And I'm thinking here of Book 8, where Socrates is staged, and I insist on staged, to ask Glaucon, do you want us, I quote, like Homer, to invoke the Muses to tell us how first dissension fell upon them? This is the prophecy of the Muses. Shall we imagine that they speak to us in a high-flown tragic tones, as if they were playing with little children and teasing them by pretending to be speaking seriously? End of quote. To this derisive staging of Homer's supernatural characters, periodically described with a discrediting emphasis on the feminine, high-flown, tragic tones, and with this mocking of the little children who could possibly listen seriously to such ineptitude, Glaucon responds, naively held in suspense like a child to his father's words, what would they say? And indeed, Socrates proceeds to describe for the whole Book 8, I believe, yeah, because they end with the tyrant in Book 9, to describe in detail, if we act as if the Muses were right, so there's a double hypothesis really, and conflict so decay, or fallibility as well as conflict, fallibility in the epistemological realm, right, and then conflict in terms of political manifestation thereof, so decay over time within the allegedly perfect city, just city, Callipolis, would transform into democracy, famously democracy, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny. So the whole Book 8 is considering this completely discredited, obviously completely wrong hypothesis, yet we spend so much effort on it. I don't think we need to adhere to the declensionist narrative in any more literal of a way, the declensionist narrative in Book 8, than to the literary rest, but the very fact of granting such importance to the passage of time throws a wrench into the reading of the Republic as utopia. And I would argue that, excuse me, that this goes beyond the ways in which Miguel Abansur, for example, tells us that, for instance, Marx and Engels rejected utopian socialisms, right? But really, they were after a communist horizon that would stand as a utopian telos for their aspirations. And so Abansur emphasizes the sort of aspirational nature of utopia as a standard on which to judge a sort of process of leaning, a telic process of leaning towards that. Similarly, one could read Plato as having simply set up utopia as aspiration, the Callipolis as an aspiration, recognizing that even the most just rulers are fallible, but it's still worth an approximation, right? A bastard form thereof. I would want to entertain instead, in a perhaps somewhat more Manichaean way, but we'll see what we make of that and we can discuss it, a more radical break from utopia. Either the just city operates as a project capable of defying the problem of time, the problem at hand, which is ultimately not so much justice, but really the problem is about stability, stabilizing the contestation over power by finding a criterion for it. It's an epistemological criterion for it. So either the utopia secures a stillness in time, or that would be grounded in knowledge, or that endeavor is not possible. There's nothing indicating that a halfway point is actually what the text is after. If that's the case, that the utopia fails, then rather than settle for less, which would be a potential suggestion of the text, which I reject, one might need to do away altogether with a utopian imaginary structure of thought, and utopian thought structure altogether. Indeed, perhaps the Republic, read in this minor way as a radically tragic aporia, as a play, as polyphonous, does not necessarily advocate this, right? But it stages within one text both a praise of utopia and a radical dismissal thereof, reckoning with utopia's reactionary, damaging, and damaged nature. And the critique of utopia I am after is precisely not about settling for less. I'm not one of those anti-utopians who want to, go with something like reform rather than revolution, right? Compromise, but rather underscoring that utopian imagination was all along deeply destructive, untenable, unsustainable, unacceptable, ethically even, and that a radical project would actually let go of such imaginary, such structure of thought to espouse immanence, becoming, time, because that's what we're left with, as beyond even those archetypal types that Book 8 enumerates in this cycle of time, right, which don't seem convincing either to me. So let us then read the Republic not as programmatic utopia, but as tragic aporia, not as a proposal to build or even aspire to utopias in approximation, but as a tragedy staging the inevitability of time as aporia, which in its wake incites the relentless and open-ended questioning of power and truth together and apart. What would occur if we were to take this minor Plato and deploy him as trickster playwright into the world stage where humans and non-humans are merely players today, saturated as it is with an endlessly dualist battle between science and heresy, truth and fake news, conspiracy and critique, techno-fix and sophistry, and where what poses for, quote, solutions of the planetary ecological catastrophe, some would like to reduce a global climate crisis to a simply Platonic infused positivism inherited from the major Plato. So one last thing, so as to fail to conclude, and I think, I still have time. So I wanted to make sure to keep lots of time for discussion, because I'm actually really much more interested in posing this as a question to you than making this really an argument. So in previous work, I'm just going to connect this critique of utopia or utopia as imaginary structure of thought, right? And as program politically to previous work that I've done. So in previous work, to which I was gesturing in the beginning of the talk, this book that I'm finishing this fall is titled Beyond Uchronia. I have argued that the hegemonic timescape we find ourselves in, seemingly trapped in our current ecological political predicament, can be characterized as what I have called Uchronia. And by this term, I did not mean to refer to the counterfactual SF stories, the man in the high castle, what if this happened, then we can change history. That's not the sense of the word that I mean by this. My concept of Uchronia instead refers to the fact that in a capitalist timescape, at myriad timescales, we run desperately after a fetishized time, so EU chronos, EU, right? That is also a non-time, ou chronos, OU, right? Insofar as such a time will never come, so it's a non-time in that sense, but it's waived as a horizon of relief and stillness, of perfection, which by definition recedes, as a horizon does, as one approaches it. Uchronia, as a critical concept, builds, of course, off of major Platonist Thomas More's invention of the term utopia, right, as the good place and the non-place. But of course, rather than praising the time of the Capitalocene, as it's sometimes been called, I would say racial, perhaps, Capitalocene, for lack of a better term, as an epoch of good time, hardly. My provocation aims to, in that work, in that previous work, to reverse usual charges against radically other planetary, more than human living and non-living assemblages, other forms that often have been dismissed as allegedly utopian, right? So you look at the ZAD, Zone à défendre, right? In France that gather against big projects like airport building, dams, etc. You look at the No DAPL mobilization in North Dakota a few years ago. You look at all these spaces that like that experiment with other ways of living, but that are not new ways by any means, that are being reaffirmed and have been forever. And those are often dismissed as, oh, utopianism, and, completely disconnected from some sort of real that we're supposed to immediately associate with the capitalist horizon, right? But the market, let's be realistic, right? So that gesture of dismissal of radicality as utopian, there's the dismissal, but there's also those of us on the left who participate in such radical mobilizations and experimentations, or I don't want to call them experimentations really, because they are, again, reaffirming other modes of life that have always been. Even some of us on the left are sometimes tempted, it's not just a dismissive gesture, right? Some of us are tempted to actually identify with utopia, right? It is actually a trope of the left to like call oneself utopian. And part of my argument is to say we're shooting ourselves in the foot when we're doing that. And rather, why don't we flip the terms to accuse capitalist horizons of utopianism and point out that utopianism is in fact an extremely deadly structure of thought that erases our relationship to, I don't want to say nature, to the non-human, right? That damages profoundly the relationships to the non-human. And so that's what I take from this counter reading, I guess, of the Republic as a failure of utopia. Not suggesting that we should try to approximate Callipolis, but just let's let go of like clearly what's demonstrated in the literary text as literary text is that the failure is radical and a completely different imaginary needs to be read in the negative of the allegorical gesture. I guess I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, actually, I agree that this can be interpreted as sort of facing aporia. And I'm not saying that aporia is not a thing. We were just talking about fetishes in philosophy, as you know. Something that simply reflects upon itself as an aporic impossibility. That was a completely different conversation, and what you argue here is convincing. Yeah, utopia is kind of facing us with sort of an aporia, and I've been thinking, whether there is a political utopia that isn't kind of in a way also dystopia, and the author is kind of aware that there is sort of a hubris there in proposing what this ideal society would look like, and this taking risk and responsibility is it seems to me present in all of this utopian political proposals. So there is a sort of implicit aporia that the author is faced with. Let's put it that way. I'm not sure if it's correct, but you led me into thinking in that direction. So, maybe there is something there. So it was quite inspiring, actually. So nothing against aporia, in fact. I just wanted to comment on something technical, because we keep mentioning this, and we find it also interesting that Greek philosophy, some of the authors we discussed, even Roman or Greek philosophy from Roman era is poetic or sort of poetry. It was until it had to be. Everything was verse. Now, why was it verse? Why was it either epic poem or verse of some other sorts? Because we don't know what the genre, let's put it that way. For example, the Heraclitean fragments belong to, or the atomist fragments. Some of them seem to be part of epic poems. Some of them are obviously verse. There is meter there, etc. But we do not, because they're fragments, we do not know what type of literature they belong to. So I would say that I'm mentioning this because it's important to consider as a historical material, facts, the context that the only format in which you could express yourself in a way that mattered, could be remembered for generations to come, was poetry, was verse, was a formula of sorts, because epic poetry is formulaic poetry. And it depends on the form is always there, hexameter or pentameter or I don't know, iambic verse, but the combinations are sort of preset. That's the interesting part, maybe, to comment on in relation to formalism, especially. So there is formalism of that sort as well. So that's what I wanted to comment on. And now about Plato and his dialogues. It's always a dialogue. So it's always as if a Greek tragedy. So the interesting thing to note here is that in the Republic, he banishes poetry, right, from the ideal city. But he saves tragedy, obviously, because he preserves the tragic dialogical form. So it's interesting that even though tragedy was also poetry, basically Plato transforms it into sort of a prose. And the first actually really proper philosophical prose we get is again Aristotle. I'm sorry to keep mentioning, but that is so yeah, it's of course I agree that the form is Plato's Republic is a dramaturgy. Also for these reasons, for historical, technical reasons, it had to be. It's also dramaturgy because it's written in that way, which is interesting, and it's well written as a tragedy. Now you're stating that there is a plot there, philosophical plot in the tragedy, because we are faced with aporia. Why do you think he moves from poetry away from poetry to dialogue, to something that it takes the format of Greek tragedy? Would you consider the possibility that it might be because of the dialectique, so the conversation, dialectics in this sense, and it's present in the form of the Greek tragedy and dramaturgy as such? And if this suggestion holds, what can we take from that for the way we do philosophy nowadays? So, okay, I postulated the thing, and now I'm
Thank you.
an opinion, but does it make any sense to you? And what would you add to it?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. You're asking way too much, I think. That would be like a lifetime's like research program, right? If I could, especially the last part of your question about like why is it that we do philosophy in this particular way,
No,
that's
do it the same way again,
like right place.
dramaturgical way.
Yeah.
Like
I wish,
like in a theater play or.
Well, my personal plan is to get tenure and then write plays. Just, I'm kidding. I'm not capable of it, I don't think, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'll just like, I don't know if I have any answer for all of this very rich comment. Thank you for them, and I'll ponder them. The one thing that maybe I could maybe sort of begin to perhaps say something or other on is what you're saying about his moving from poetry to tragedy because dialectique.
Yeah,
I'm not sure, like, I mean, this would probably take a several hours conversation, but I'm not sure that I'm completely sold on that movement exactly, because I think, like I tried to say, perhaps clumsily, but I think the Republic is even more than maybe I didn't say that, but I think that the Republic is perhaps even more than a tragedy, but a multi-genre assemblage, like a bastard form, right? I mean, I think somewhere Derrida says like never mix genres, something like that, right? And Plato is like completely unapologetically, right? Like this dialogues that insert in which are inserted allegories, then an analogy, then it's so so I'm not sure that he moves. I'm not sure I understand, yeah, he banishes the poets, but he also keeps citing them, right? So poetry does keep erupting like a volcano underneath the earth that he's trying to stabilize, and the earthquakes are full of all sorts of forms, not just tragic. There's irony, there's parody, etc. So is that the forms, plural, that dialectics needs to take? Maybe. I'm not sure. And in what ways is that manifested then in philosophy, in philosophical practice today, for example? That part I don't think I have an answer because, and also I'm not sure that I would be not just capable, but necessarily all that interested in answering that, because I actually don't care about philosophy ultimately as a discipline. Not quite in that way. What I'm interested in is like the political effects. Like one thing that I've been, I mean, the reason why I put this together really recently is because I keep teaching at the intro level in my intro to political theory class. I keep teaching Plato and then teaching, I thought I was like proposing to my students, here's the Republic, and I'm going to teach Val Plumwood's critique of the dualism in Plato and how that affects like our ecological political conundrum today. She's doing that as an ecofeminist philosopher, right? Then assigning, Irigaray and her psychoanalytical critique of the cave, Deleuze and his logic of sense, etc. And I thought I was like staging a juxtaposition of text and teaching that way, where we have Plato and then we love to hate him. But then as I keep teaching it, I actually love to love him. Right. And so I'm more and more convinced with the fact, I don't know, I don't know what I'm convinced about, but I was that?
Toxic.
He's toxic, but that's the thing is, yeah, like what I guess that what I'm trying to say is that what I'm most interested in is not so much like what is the status of philosophical discourse today then, or what is how do we do dialectics, and does it have to be multi-literary forms, etc., but more so how, like, in spite, I guess what I'm trying to get at with the example of like how you teach it is how is it that year after year, all of us who teach Plato, I think I don't think I've presented anything new under the sun for any of the people present in the room, I think, right? And yet, he shows up, like we all know, and we push the students to think, and we think with them about all these tensions and how Plato actually undermines the Western obsession to truth, the will to truth and the will to power that like is so predominant in politics. Like he gives us the tools for contesting that. And yet the ways in which the Platonic legacy operates in political discourse completely reinscribes the will to truth as a way to ground power. Right, so that's what I'm interested in more so is like thinking about politics from there. And I'm not sure how philosophical that is, but yeah, maybe it needs to, yeah, maybe dialectics needs to take several genres.
That's very useful. Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
dramaturgical.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
tragedy.
Well, and drama contains all the forms, right?
It's the same structure of comments.
I mean, it kind of speaks to, if I may just say one more thing, it kind of speaks to what we were talking about yesterday in discussing Thomas's talk and the quote that you had by Nietzsche about the dancing star. When Nietzsche puts together like another part of this book project is the stuff on the eternal return, and when he puts forth the eternal return as a concept, he doesn't really, what he does is he writes Zarathustra, and Zarathustra keeps thus spoke Zarathustra, but Zarathustra never speaks, like he never actually says shit, right? And so but that's symptomatic of something. I think like maybe philosophy is incapable in that like treatise type form of saying of thinking chaos and motion and all that. Like it's in out, and maybe it's found in dance. Like that's why I was mentioning in terms of the dancing star, the work of say Martha Graham, etc. I find myself more compelled in terms of responding to the ecological catastrophic situation today by dance forms, for instance, than by, yeah.
Thank you.
Does that?
Yeah,
I don't know if it
brilliant.
makes any sense.
Very good. Thanks. We have a question here.
Yeah, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So, there are a lot of terms that we understand differently from ancient times, from idiot to democracy and so on.
Uh-huh.
So, when we use the term utopia about Plato, we use Middle Ages term that was not present in the ancient time as a term.
Right.
So, how Plato was thinking
Right.
about his explanation of things, how they should be. So, was he thinking of writing the Republic as an utopian work or something else?
Mhm.
Is utopia a term like idiot and democracy, a term that we understand differently from ancient time?
Yeah.
And is our treatment of explanations of how things should be as utopia something that is blocking our efforts to fight climate crisis?
Yeah.
And also, final word, is it maybe utopianism today to think that things can be as they are in the future without making radical change?
Say that
For
last part
example,
again.
a person who thinks that it's impossible to radical changing things.
Mhm.
Is this opinion in fact utopianism? Because if
Yeah.
we don't think change,
Uh-huh.
if we don't radically change things,
Uh-huh.
then things will not be status quo. And is this the real utopianism?
Yeah. Yes. I'm not sure I have much to say to you, except I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the anachronistic back reading of utopianism onto the text, like guilty of charge for sure. But that's part of my point, right? Is to say that in the text there's no utopia, and yet the text is deployed politically constant. I mean, not the text literally, but all sorts of Platonic gesture. I mean, it's incredible how that obsession of truth that we have, like even in ordinary. I always take this example, I'm sure some of you do too, I don't know, but in teaching Plato with the students is, you can so easily say, oh, this is not wine, about a wine that you deem is not good, right? So the good and the true wine like are the same category. That's, I mean, Platonic thinking in that major caricatural version that we have is omnipresent in the West, or this obsession of truth. And it shapes so much of, but yes, I do think it blocks our capacity. You said our capacity to think of how to respond to the climate crisis. I don't see, that's one example. The very phrase climate crisis, I think is already a conceptual structure that is blocking the way in which we should respond to the ecological catastrophe. Maybe would be more the way I would put it, right? Like there's no crisis because crisis connotes a certain kind of cyclical linear temporality with perhaps a hope of coming back to a previous pre-crisis state, right? Or some approximation thereof. And this is not a crisis. What we're experiencing right now is more like a collapse, right? And so, but yet we keep speaking of a climate crisis, and we keep speaking, that to me is a political pseudo-Platonic gesture, is we keep talking about, or we, the media, whatever, mainstream environmentalists, as well as their detractors, keep talking about the climate crisis, and yet climate is the tip of the freaking iceberg that's melting, right? It's one of many, many, many collapses and catastrophes that are ongoing. We have biodiversity loss, extinction that overlaps with climate, but it's constantly amalgamated as if it was one single problem, but it's actually much beyond climate that this extinction is taking place. You know, pesticides are a distinct thing from, right? And monocropping, like, you know, pollution, the enormous risk, for example, that climate in turn causes for us to witness all sorts of nuclear accidents all over, right? As we see system collapse, it's very likely that there's going to be a lot of Fukushimas coming, right? Pandemics, etc. Those are very multi-dimensional problems, and yet we keep like making it into an essence, which is climate. And that reductionism, like that's one of the ways in which a certain kind of utopian structure or a certain kind of essentialist structure like blinds us or blocks us from responding. So yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, there could be more, but yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks, Claire. John, and then I'll go to you.
Thanks very much for a great paper. I was just wondering if going to the theme of movement and time, the passage of time, and in as much as you want to supplant a kind of utopic thinking as, you know, like a passage towards an end, a kind of teleological movement, most recent like desire, perhaps something like that. And what you're offering in place of that, because you're talking about mass conversion, mass conversion, and thinking about turnings and reversals and revolutions and things. And the idea of aporia, as you know, it means impasse, impossibility of passage. So it sounds like it's almost like a sort of dialectical or logicist approach that the aporia, the tragic aporia within the Republic of this, the impossibilities going on there. For instance, like in the allegory of the cave, there is you've got these chained inhabitants, and the kind of I don't know how to pronounce the Greek word. It's that period, this notion of the alternative. How do you get that from looking at the shadows of all to turn away from that and exit the cave? And it's almost like a mystery. How do you get them to turn? They go out, of course, they leave the cave. They can't see the sun directly, thinking. They go back in, but how are they going to get those people to move, to change, to turn?
Get out of our chains.
And is there? It just seems pretty abstract. This notion of aporia, the dialectic between aporia, as a way to make things move, to change society. If maybe I'm projecting there. So in terms of against the kind of strange attractor of utopia that bring desire, sounding great, isn't it? But bring desires to instead from the tragedy of aporia, impasse, there's a different kind of movement going on that will change society. Is that what you're thinking?
No, thank you for that. So there's several things here because I'm tempted to I could go let's have a close text reading of the allegory of the cave right now kind of route, which I don't know that we have
just there.
Yeah, but my immediate objection though, and so I'm not going to do that, but on the text though, I would object, it's perhaps too strong, but I would slightly disagree with you about the mystery. I don't think it's mysterious. I think there's coercion, it's violence, right? Like, I mean, the prisoners are dragged out of the cave. It's very forceful, like throughout the text, like what's mysterious is who does the dragging. Like that's like who's the first one to get out? How did he come out? Were the chains imperfectly like chained? Like we don't know anything about that. Like the first philosopher who allowed, like we know that the way in which the prisoners come out is violent and is forceful and is done and is imposed coercively by some other force or someone else, but and it becomes clear who does that once you have a system of education. I mean, it's really education, right? So once you have the system in place, is the philosophers teaching that do the dragging, but where did the original, like the first teacher who was arguably chained, or was there someone who had been forgotten and who was hiding in the cracks of the cave, not being chained and able to like explore? we don't have that origin point or something like, I mean, we could find it in other dialogues, I guess, like we could think of reminiscence and,
If you don't know that,
mystical
it
moment.
could be your own humor.
Yeah. So that's the most important part, right, of the question probably is what's the alternative to, so I'm not trying to say that instead of utopia, we should embrace aporia exactly. I think what I'm trying to say is that utopia is aporetic, and that and so let's let go of utopian imagination. But not all imagination has to be aporetic to me, right? Like, but aporia supposes a telos, like you said, right? That will not be met, that will not be attained. And so if we get rid of any of this kind of telic engagement with epistemology, with politics, like with knowledge and with politics, with knowledge and power, and instead there's an embracing of immanence, of motion, etc., then I don't think that impossibility remains necessarily, right? There might be some little possibilities and little impossibilities, and they might move, but so a more concrete way to put this, I guess I haven't figured that out. I'm not sure. Maybe I will, but maybe I won't in this book project. But in my first book project, because this book project is more about, like Nietzsche, Plato, Beckett, and staying with the trouble, so to speak. So like not necessarily proposing some alternative way than utopia or that kind of thing. That's not what I'm necessarily after in this one. But in my first book that I'm finishing right now about like a critique of Uchronia, what I try to do is, identify this Uchronia, what I'm calling Uchronia, and then from there, one, recognizing that so much of the environmental discourse is indeed still very caught up in telic, like progress enamored discourse, even as it critiques progress, right? So geoengineering, techno-fixing, environmentalists, big quotes on environmentalists there, but they think they are. But even, people like Greta Thunberg, who, interpolates the UN and tries to reverse the gerontocratic relation there, saying, how dare you? And she's like, right, she's blaming the previous generation as the incarnation of the future, saying, you've stolen my future. That's one of the, so I have a close textual reading of her speeches in my first book on Uchronia, trying to say, well, it's all great that Greta's there. She's more and more great when she goes with the flotilla to Palestine. I think she was less convincing. She was less convincing to me with the Fridays, etc., because I felt like she was very much the incarnation of a still caught up in Uchronia type of generational discourse that erases what's here and now and the actually lived futures, right? She was reducing things to a generational struggle in a way. And that erases, all sorts of inequalities globally in terms of impact and responsibilities, right? So beyond that kind of linear time. So that's part of the critique, is not only to identify capitalist temporality as Uchronian, but also see that some of the criticisms against that from an environmental perspective end up falling in the same trap and acting like counter-Uchronias. So even that's still lacking as an alternative. But then to me, the alternative I'm landing on so far is this notion of trying to rethink revolution. Or I'm saying rethink, but that's I'm being abusive here because I'm not rethinking. I'm mostly drawing from Thomas's thinking of revolution. Revolution as temporality is one of the ways in which I'm trying to think what kind, how do we get out of the aporia and the utopia? Or it's not even getting out of it anyway. We've never been in it. That's all, it's been destructive, but all along, there's the way in which we live day to day is not fundamentally this capitalist telic horizon, right? What makes us keep going and be alive? I mean, that's also I guess where I go to with that in terms of the alternative temporalities is also J.K. Gibson Graham's work, the critique of capitalocentrism, right? Most of the spaces we're in, maybe not most, but many are not capitalist. right? When I feed my kids, I'm not just reproducing capitalism, right? So there's plenty of time spaces at different time scales that are beyond the utopian and the Uchronian of capitalism. And so looking at that for alternatives,
Okay.
you know, so it's already existing and imminent, but yeah, anyways, I'm not sure.
No,
Sorry.
Andrew and then Thomas.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I apologize if this question is a little associative, but just take it as a compliment because it was inspiring and blind thinking. And I really appreciate your approach to kind of like making Plato this minor figure, especially approaching it, you know, from the position of form and everything like this. It's really interesting. I kind of wanted to take the previous comment as a kind of point of departure, talking about the issue of anachronism and those kinds of things with approaching the Republic and this utopian kind of critique. But I would say, you know, I think it's a really interesting approach, and I really love, you know, the idea of sort of, you know, sort of troubling or looking for those instances in Plato's writing that trouble the dualisms that he usually draws between things that we might argue do actually constitute our notion of utopia. Dualisms like those between, since we're talking about Callipolis, the polis, and the outside or chora, these kinds of dualities that kind of exist and structure a lot of the dialogues and things like that. And I'm thinking specifically of one, and I'll mention it, but I mean, you have these kinds of instances where those dualisms are perhaps a little bit troubled. I wonder if also of the Republic for some of those instances, but also instances in which encounters with like the non-human force the aporia into movement and force these things into motion. You know, the Phaedrus is like a good example of this, where, you know, you have this moment with Socrates, the most, you know, authorial, static figure is literally, it says drawn out of the polis, which I really love this narrative. And then as soon as he comes into the chora, you know, which we have outside, it's like super undulatory, continuous thing.
Absolutely.
He's like they're met with this swarm of cicadas that are like murmuring and like buzzing overhead. And it literally says, you know, it wrenches him from this point of ascendancy. And, you know, he looks up and realizes that he's the one captured in the gaze of this swarm. And it says that, you know, they're reflected on the fact that they appear like slaves to them as they're coming out of the city into this.
That's great.
This kind of, you know, these kinds of little gestures that are kind of all throughout. So are you tracing these things outside of the Republic as well, and looking for these encounters where even Socrates is put into movement, and like these sort of dualisms are kind of thrown asunder for
disoriented?
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Thank you. I'm not so far. Maybe you've changed my mind. I mean, the minute you said the chora, I was like, oh yeah, Phaedrus. Yeah, I love that passage too. I mean, but even in the Republic, arguably there's everything in the Republic. Maybe there's the teacher in me that feels that way because it's like simple to assign, like at least the first 8 books, right, of the Republic. The 9 and 10 are kind of redundant to an extent, but or recapitulate. I mean, they're interested in that themselves, depending on what you want to do with the text. But what I'm trying to say is that, like, even in the Republic, it's not like, you know, I often teach, for example, Val Plumwood's critique of the dualism in Plato, and yet every single time I feel unconvinced by that ecofeminist critique, because the thing is, it's like the dualism, like the notion that Plato's ontology is dualistic is actually super contestable. I mean, you know, when you look at the myth of metals, it's not 2, it's 3. And throughout, that triad is taken up again, not just ontologically, but also it pours into the epistemology. So, you know, I think that I have plenty to deal with the Republic. Maybe I'll consider looking at, but I'm not really interested in Plato himself per se, or Nietzsche or Beckett. I'm just like trying to look at a few texts that form a very opportunistic purposes as a political theorist, to think against a certain kind of environmental imaginary of endism, apocalypticism, and anti-environmental imaginary of, ruthless progress and techno, I don't know what, I don't want to say techno-feudalism, I disagree with that, but techno-capitalism, like either, like I want to push against both of those for a different kind of ecological thinking. And so I'm kind of being like, feral in terms of my reading of texts, in terms of my picking which texts are useful for that. But I'll consider the fitters. Yeah, thank you for that. That's great.
That's good. Those,
Oh, yeah, thanks, Claire. That was so great. I really liked the paper started happening, just like you said, but it was like, yeah, we know, and you're like, I know you know, and we know, and you kind of go along, and then suddenly there's this moment, and it just kind of like hit me. I'm like, actually, this is still a really good question, and it like never goes away, and it's totally it's seductive about Plato. You're right, it's like toxic, but he brings you in. He's like, yeah, but I'm not toxic, and then you get there, like, yeah, but you kind of are. And it's just like weird ambiguities, but he brings you in with like the ambiguity. It's something that I always find myself, but also second on the Phaedrus, like Timaeus and the Phaedrus are my favorite text, but still the Republic, you're right. It's still big. It's got almost everything. Okay, sorry, that's not really. I just wanted to say thank you. It was great style paper too. Two short comments, one question. One short comment is kind of what Katerina was saying about the form of the poetic verse. And I just wanted to respond to that very quickly because it is interesting in the context of your paper to think about that. Is that this was a great moment when I was getting like really into Lucretius and I thought I knew something and it turned out to be totally wrong, which is the structure of hexameter. Katerina was saying, oh, this fixed form in the poetic verse. No, it's not at all. And that, like, I'm wrong, I'm misunderstanding something, like, I'm just not a Latinist and I don't really get it. And then I looked it up and it's Latin, it's like, actually, in reality, there's really, the hexameter is nothing pure hexameter. It's it doesn't work, so they just make stuff up. No, I'm serious, they change the meter. It's never perfect. Homer is a mess. If you start getting into it, and Homer is screwing up. Oh yes, he is. I'll send you the articles. It is not.
Occasional substitutes of Iambic solutions when it's impossible, but it's either hexameter or pentameter. It's just
okay. I'll send you the article. I'll send you the article.
Master like that.
I'll send you the article because Greek scholars have like tracked all the instances. Now you're right. You're right. It's not like all. It's not like it's all like that. It's most.
It happens enough to.
It happens enough to question the fact that this is not hexameter, and that the instances, this is a hypothesis that I can't claim to have found, but I will one day investigate this, but my hunch is that the actual distribution of errors inside the hexameter, but I can't prove that, I just think that the ratio is mostly like a lot of hexameter that works, and then like some that kind of, and then like a very few that like, anyway, so the point is there's a distribution of the errors. It's not perfect form, neither for Lucretius nor for Homer and other people too. Okay, that's the first quick point. And so that makes it interesting because there really is this creative, experimental, like inside poetic verse, there is this improvisational character. It's not locked in this metric way. Okay, the second one is about Poros. And I came to this from this is like responding to John's thing a little bit, but like, and also the Aporia, which you did clarify this, but it's just a weird point about Aporia, which is, I was recently, Détienne and Vernat's book on Metis, right? Do you know this book on Metis? Okay, so Metis is really linked to Poros, and this is like I was like reading. I did all this research about Poros, and it's connected to Thetis and all of these Greek goddesses of water and shape changing. Because the Poros is like it's a pathway. That's what it means. It's a pore that's an opening, and it's a pathway through. And that's associated with water and movement and finding many paths. This plug for Metis is also a plug for Technophony, the journal, which is now, that's the next issue, is going to be on Metis. But anyway, the point is, Aporia is like no paths. But like, exactly, that's a utopia. There's no way out. You're locked in. And so, but the opposite of that is Poros. And there's this great Greek, like Homeric tradition and language and myth, all related to the nature of Poros. And I won't go into it anymore. I'll just say we can talk more. But there's like a lot of really cool stuff in Greek, all about the Poros.
Thank you.
When Odysseus finds his way out of the cave, I'll shut up. Odysseus finds his way out of the cave. He's finding a Poros.
The Poros,
and so he's the one who finds the Poros using the Metis to get him out of the cave. But of course, it's a super contextual trickery, you know, to get, you know, whatever the way he gets out of the cave.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the question, which is, thinking of, my question is like, what are some examples that you think of that kind of bring together this image of this alternate way of thinking, like through images, through performance, through trickery, through imminence, and through movement that's not about Maria and this whole utopian tradition, or
Thank you for
Ucronia.
that. Yeah.
And my one thing that came to mind, I don't know if you would agree with, is Zapatismo. Like when you read Subcomandante Marcos, he has all these kind of like fictive personalities, but also dialogues, but also mythology, but also kind of literary stories. And it's mixed it with indigenous and Marxist traditions. Like to me, that's one example I was thinking of, but maybe you have others, or maybe you wouldn't agree with that.
Thank you, Thomas. I can try to be brief because I don't know how much time
we're okay. You can
you'll
just ask
me.
question, but don't feel rushed.
Okay. I mean that's why. Thank you for writing the book on revolution and Zapatismo, because that's you know. So yes, that example would the examples that I have for what I'm calling like revolution as temporality, rather than the revolution thought as like a dated. Specifically dated, like the myth of the great knights, tabula rasa type revolution, which is another form of utopia within the left, right? Like that imaginary of revolution. I want to push that aside, but like revolution as the becoming revolutionary. That's to me like at the conceptual level. That's the way in which I want to try to counter Uchronia, and the instances of that you're asking. We can talk about them more in how it is that they, to me, can offer openings for something else than Uchronia. But I turn in the book I'm finishing, I turn to performative arts, and especially dance, specifically there's this piece by Pina Bausch that I look at in detail that's called Full Moon, and where Pina Bausch, famous modern choreographer, hopefully everybody knows about her, but she put an enormous rock on stage and poured tons of water on the stage and had her dancer do their Pina Bauschian spiral dance, because it's very Martha Grahamian, right? So the spirals that you were talking about are very, very present at the level of the spine, and Martha Graham's I mean, to me, you were saying that Wolf is a philosopher. To me, like dance choreographers, especially post Martha Graham, are very much philosophers, right? All of them read Nietzsche, which is I just finished an article on Nietzsche and dance and the eternal return that's going to come out in Substance hopefully soon, but and where I talk about this, but the whole like the theory that Martha Graham developed for founding modern dance away from the ethereal ballet dancer was all about looking at, she was inspired from the notion of Kundalini energy and so this notion of uncoiling the serpent that's at the base of the spine by doing all sorts of release and extension with the spine in spiral form. So dance as a form seems to me like one of the ways in which many ways, really. I think that, I mean, honestly, I think that's most of what life and non-life does. And then the anomalous thing that's destroying us, that's Uchronia, is really like taking all the visibility in the show and destroying so much that we have to contend with it. But yeah, that's one of the many examples is dance. And when Pina Bausch puts on stage dancers that, like, at one point in Full Moon, there's like a dancer that lies down kind of mockingly looking at the audience and then starts like batting a tail of a lion, and so becomes this humanimal. That's what I'm calling it, like bringing up the humanimality of the on top of a stage that is flooded with water, that has this rock that looks like it's lunar, and so that kind of performative art, I think, throws a wrench into Uchronia as imaginary and allows us to see. And otherwise, I think another example I would have is I draw from graffiti arts too, and as form, just like dance, I think graffiti or street arts maybe more generally, because it tends to take place in like the urban fast spaces, but then it catches your eye as you you're driving or you're walking, biking, taking the train, and you catch a fresco by a graffiti artist, and it's supposed to like catch you very fast in this like fast pace of Uchronia. and yet it arrests your gaze, and you might even contemplate it for a while, even though it's not in a museum. Museum being the ultimate heterotopia, as per Foucault's term. So as form, graffiti art is fantastic, and there's one particular graffiti artist that I look at whose name is Blue, B-L-U, Italian graffiti artist, probably. He's very, very famous, but you have to know a little bit about graffiti, I guess. I say he, but I should say they actually, because that's also what one thing I love as a feminist about graffiti arts is that you can't know at all the authorship. It's all there's no artist behind the art because it's all anonymous and yeah, under the radar of the police. But Blue is like very much a graffiti artist that's very engaged in anarchist circles, etc. And there's a few frescoes that are fantastic by them that actually thematize time and ecology and sort of make time be the metonym for ecology. And I could say more about that, but maybe I don't know if I have.
But I think we can maybe, you have some time, we can maybe go to 15:15.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so don't feel that. If there is another question, someone got any other question? Yep.
I was curious about this. I don't know Plato, I haven't and I wonder Republic very well, but as this kind of idealism of the elites, what do you think is the political potential of the elites just failing, as they are now? But there's this kind of idea that they're trying to do something about the climate crisis, but
That's good.
on a community level, for example, what is the political potential of them just kind of not managing or giving up, for example, with Trump, leaving all of these agreements and so on that he actually.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thank you. That's an awesome question, actually, because it's also, I think, that question of the elites doing something about climate change is also a whole temporality question, right? There's this tendency, I think, in environmental discourse, very writ large, of bemoaning the way in which the mobilization is not commensurate with the urgency, right? Here we are, the whole ship is sinking and we're doing nothing, right? That's one of the lamentations that we hear a lot when there's some level of environmental coming to consciousness. There's this, but look at this, the planet's burning and we're doing nothing. So urgency versus the paralysis or this, not stasis, I don't want to say stasis, especially but in this context. And I think that's very interesting and symptomatic of a sort of erasure of what's happening in terms of the actual mobilization or conflict ongoing, the antagonism that's staging itself planetarily. And on that paralysis urgency, I think what that lamentation masks is the fact that, one, the elites are very much doing lots of things. What they're doing is working super hard to keep the status quo. And so when we're being told, oh, Trump got out of the Paris Accord, he's an anti-environmental, and what is he thinking? And the planet is burning, and he doesn't realize the urgency. Actually, what's insane making, it seems to me, and I was so relieved to see that, even though I have a lot of problems with Andres Malm as an eco-Leninist, but when he came out with his book Overshoot last year, I was exhausting myself trying to add in my book a part about how the Paris Accords are complete sophistry, but then I don't have the kind of documentation abilities that Andres Malm deployed in Overshoot. And so I was really glad that he documented that, really what the elites are doing, not just Trump, but the neoliberals, greenwashers of the world, is that they're busying themselves very much doing something, which is deploy all sorts of eco-fixery, including geoengineering, but not only, there's been this shift in discourse, I think, recently, whereby I don't know if you've ever tested that among your students, but more and more of my students, and I don't think it's just Vassar College or that kind of thing, I think it's symptomatic of something, feel like, yes, nuclear energy could be a solution for climate change. You know, so that mantra, that doxa, has actually like been propagandized enough to be effective and to do work in ordinary discourse, which is maddening because clearly, you know, it seems clear to me, maybe it's a different generation, true, but that environmentalism and nuclearism don't work together by any means, any stretch of the imagination, and that the stress, the ecological collapses that are ongoing are not like, you can't solve climate change by creating nuclear catastrophe. That makes no sense. But, you know, and that's why like we need to resist, I think, like reducing the ecological collapse to climate, right? And seeing the multi-dimensionality, multi-prop. So, but yeah, so the elites are very much doing something. They're doing what they're meant to do. The vampire that is the capitalist will suck the blood because it's a vampire. It needs to feed off of the blood. The state will definitely destroy the planet. Like we have nothing to expect from the state. And another thing it's doing besides like, you know, geoengineering, ecofixery, nuclear as the ultimate, I mean, the nuclear imaginary and its temporality is fascinating to me, right? And especially coming from France, where 80% of the electricity is nuclear, you know, it's one of the ways in which France has sold nuclear as the paradigm. It's very temporal. Is this promise of nuclear, you know, going like nuclear fission, nuclear fusion, like saying, well, eventually we'll get there so that we can actually not need the uranium extraction and not depend upon Africa, right? And so eventually nuclearity will be eternalist. There's not going to be any waste, right? That's one of the ways in which nuclearity has been legitimized, is with this eternalist like temporality. I find that fascinating. So yes, so the elites are doing what they should be doing given their function, which is destroy the planet. I'm being very Manichaean here, but you know, I think it's actually true. Sometimes Manichaeanism is what it. And then meanwhile, another thing the states are doing is killing environmental radical possibilities and killing the activists that are embodying that, right? Like if everywhere, I would argue, Western world or not, those activists who are the most often killed tend to be environmental activists, right? And the sort of retreat that we've seen of any sort of, I don't want to say freedom of speech because that's such a like liberal trope that I'm not, you know, enamored with, but any sort of like, you know, repressive, like the increase in repression against radical mobilization that we've seen in at least the Western democracies that have always patted themselves on the back for being so, you know, into freedom of speech. Like there's been such a regression on that and a crystallization of neo-fascists as well as authoritarian neoliberals recently. Why is that? Because they're terrified when they see projects like the ZAD, etc., the No DAPL project, we can think of many more, or self-organizing to do something else. So so everybody's really busy doing lots. And when we're thinking, well, what are the, like, we're doing nothing, what are the elites? Like, we can't expect anything from the elites, but repression and continuation of the same telic progress, technofix orientation. And so, yeah, I think that's what I have to say about the elites doing something.